This is Writer Life, a podcast about writing, life, coffee and conversation with Rob and John Morgan.
Hello and welcome to Writer Life. Today I want to go back and look at the books Rise of the Raven and The Circle of Darkness. And I'm going to focus this podcast on the traits of darkness. Throughout all of my life, and I'm quite sure many other people, I've encountered many injustices. And I think it is something that most people can relate to. Now, it matters not if it's sexism or racism or any other form of hateful discrimination. I think all of us know it when we come across it. I've always thought that those who do it and do it openly have a darkness within them, a piece of hate that somehow festers and comes out of them in the form of their hateful words. And it is usually followed by hateful actions. We all have that ability to grow angry and at times snap back a nasty comment. But that in itself is not evil. My reason for looking back to the start of my story with Rise of the Raven was always to discover where the evil came from and how it worked into those who it touched. Through my life, as I've watched society, I've certainly encountered a few people who, for no apparent reason at all, and without any kind of provocation, they could under no circumstances be civil with any of those who surrounded them. In my youth, I encountered a young woman who was considered to be from, I would say, a well-to-do family. Her family was well off, and she was very attractive, certainly popular in certain circles. She was immaculately dressed, and due to her looks, pretty much every male I knew was into her, and they wanted to date her. Now, my problem was, I didn't. I simply did not like her, as I saw the way that she treated some of my friends, making snap judgments about them, belittling them, and trashing them to others. Her choice of words were simply vile and completely uncalled for, and yet she was praised and adored by those who surrounded her, as they fawned all over her and helped spread her gossip and her lies. My friends thought that I was mad and weird because I didn't fancy her. But I will not deny, she was without doubt possibly the most attractive girl in the college, and yet I could not look at her without feeling my distaste for her. I think what put me off her the most was she was not even nice to those who were considered part of her group, and yet they hung around with her regardless of the snide comments she made at them. It never really kind of made any sort of sense to me whatsoever. You know, it's funny. As you grow older, you forget many of the faces from that time at school, and yet it is like they are no longer relevant and have become blurred figures in your mind. And yet I've never forgotten her. I can remember her as if I saw her only yesterday. Such was my intense dislike for her. Her eyes that appeared dead to me, her tight clothing and long hair, and this kind of fixed, smug smile of superiority she always had when she looked at me. I can see them all now as I closed my eyes. Crazy as it sounds, when I noticed her looking at me, it made my skin crawl. And yet, strangely enough, she never said a word about me in all of the time that I knew of her. There were a few occasions when I faced her out and told her to stop calling one of my friends, and she would always hit me with some snide remark. But she never personally attacked me, and I cannot deny, even today, it really does puzzle me as to why not. Now, to the rest of the world, she was perfect. She was the ideal of a young, attractive female, praised and worshipped, and always spoken of in the highest regard. I always thought it was strange that none of the others who worshipped her could see her for who she really was. It was almost as if they were blinkered and incapable of seeing the truth of her. When I first started writing Heirs to the Kingdom, and I was putting together characters for the story, I would pull each character together piece by piece, and in my mind I would say things like, well, she will have the hair of such a person, and oh, definitely the attitude of so-and-so. Most of my characters were elements of 3 or 4 people, comprising of their looks, their attitude and traits. Now Albelin, who was the watcher and the wise one, I drew my inspiration for him from my grandfather, who once gave me a lot of very good advice and shared with me his wisdom. There were 1 or 2 who were based solely on other people, actual people that I knew from my past, but mostly all of my main characters were elements of many others. I often get asked which one was based on me, and it makes me laugh because if they thought about the question before they asked it, they would then realise I created all of the characters. So in a way, they're all elements of me, and I'm there in every character. But I could absolutely state without doubt, there is no one character in Heirs to the Kingdom that is based solely on myself. As I reached books 3 and 4 of the series, at that point I was considering both of the books at the same time, and I was making notes, and there was one character that would appear and play an important role, and as the series progressed, this character would ultimately become a more important figure. She would be vital towards the end of the book, and I felt any further books I wrote at that time. And as I sat back thinking about how I was going to portray her, it was the horrible girl from my past that actually sprung to mind. Now I'm talking of the character of Rhiannon. Awful as it sounds, she fitted the bill perfectly. And so I built my character around the girl who I'd once known. Now when Rhiannon first appeared in the books, she was beautiful and fair, and just like the girl from my past, everybody praised her for her looks and her prowess. She was renowned for her wisdom and great ability, and in her first few appearances in Kingdom, I wrote her with very high praise indeed, and she appeared like one of the good guys, and she was adored and loved by all of the other characters. Her entrance into the Violet Isle was grand to the extreme, as she was the Queen of Fae, of Moon, and all of the characters bowed and scraped to her. I sat back with a smirk and wondered who would see the real truth of her. I wondered, was there actually a reader out there who would see her as I did, and the girl that I actually modelled her on? I've always felt the facts were there, and yet the only person I know who actually saw the truth of her was my wife, who disliked her from the moment she entered the book. But she could not really give me any form of valid reason as to why, except she thought she was just mean, and that Rhiannon should not have picked on Sapphire over her unrequited and hidden love. Now the truth was, if you've read the books, it is clear to see how she really does not train Jade very well. When she hands her the marbles that are going to bring forth her powers, it's almost like as if she's disinterested. Now if you think about it, in the case of Rune, Opal and Steph took time out to help her adjust, and yet Rhiannon did very, very little to help Jade control what was going to become a devastating power. It was almost as if she could not really be bothered. No one actually picked up on the fact that her son Rain, who was deeply in love with Gwyn and had 2 children, and yet Rhiannon had ordered her son to separate from them and forced him to leave them behind in the realm of men and sending him back to the realm of Moon. Amethyst and Crystal had suffered for years having lost their father, and yet Rhiannon did not appear to care at all. It mattered nothing to her. that it was Rain's duty to instruct one of his daughters to take up the seat on the throne of Avalon one day. Or did it? Did it bother her at all? Or did it not really matter? In Heirs to the Kingdom, Book 5, Crystals of the Mirrored Waters, Amethyst actually takes the throne and becomes the Queen of Fae in Avalon. And yet nobody asked what I consider to be the most obvious question. Bridget Violet ruled Flore and then passed her crown down to Gwendolyn to rule over all of the Fae of Earth. Now Avalon was built to allow the Fae of Moon a place to be more open to all of the other realms, as there were protections placed on the High Moon that prevented anyone from entering, even Rain's wife. No one asked the question, why was it seen by all as one realm when it was obvious that it had now become two independent realms? Avalon and the Moon were supposed to be the same realm, and yet suddenly there were two queens, and no one appeared to ask why. Now some of this was answered in the final book, The Circle of Darkness, but even within that I held a lot back, for the full truth would only be released once I introduced Branna and Ariel, and that came later with the publication of Rise of the Raven. The story of Branna and Ariel, as was seen in Rise of the Raven, was one of deep love, a strong, unbreakable bond, but it was also a tragedy. There was no doubt it was a book nobody expected. It had political ambition, betrayal, deception on a massive scale, and as was pointed out to me by my wife shortly before it was published, it could actually be considered as a political, magical fantasy novel. I'd never really seen it that way, but as I thought about it, I realised she was indeed quite correct. The girl from my past came back into my thoughts. She too was very calculating in the way in which she manipulated people and swung opinion in her favour, and I cannot deny at the time, I did wonder if she'd ever considered a career in politics. I do fear she would have excelled at it. Maybe it was a good thing that she did not. It made me seriously consider that maybe I had subconsciously picked up on something all of those years ago, and as I considered the thought, I will not deny that in my life today, as I watch the world, I do see many politicians as having quite dark traits. Now, without thinking, I had connected the dots and used the one personality I knew well from my past, and I handed it to Rhiannon. Because Rise of the Raven was always meant to be the one book that showed the darkness that had seeped into humanity through the interactions of the Fae with them. My main intention in writing Rise of the Raven was to explore what was seen as darkness. Was the Merle as dark as it had been portrayed, or was there something else that had found its way into the lives of men? In the Circle of Darkness, Branna is seen as the one to bring down the Merle into the realm of Avalon, and then flee into the realm of men to avoid the consequences of her queen, who she hates. Now Branna is outspoken and talks openly of her opposition to the queen, something that is seen as treasonous and a violation of the creed of her people. One does not talk ill of their queen, as the queen is the ruler and the standard on which all that are fair, wise and just are measured. The Queen of Fae is seen as something more, something beyond the plain people, an almost godlike figure who can never be wrong and never be questioned. The Queens of Fae were created by Eve from the Garden of Tideguide, the purest goddess of the moon, and one of the 5 supreme beings that created all of the worlds in which they reside. The Queens of Fae were created separate from the rest of the peoples of Fae, and yet it is a known fact that once the queens were created, all of the remnants that were left of the mortal being that was Tideguide were shared amongst the people. All Fae created after contained a small part of the sacred moon goddess and carried within their lines some part of the garment of tide guide, which endowed their lines with a longer life and physical beauty to blend with the gifts of fellowship and earth. The Fae were created to seek out the beauty of the world and enhance it. They were sent into the world of men to aid them and show them how to improve their lives, as the Fae brought with them gifts of basket and cloth weaving, herb lore and culture. The Fae of Earth travelled widely under the guidance of Bridget, Violet and Aneria, and they populated the isles of Erin, Iona and finally Flore. Rhiannon stayed on the moon, and she sought to create a castle of great wonder, built from the ores of precious metals and crystals her Fae of Moon mined from the lands of the men. Now, whilst Bridget and her people worked hard to enhance the lives of those they met, and lived a very simple life that blended with the natural world, Rhiannon grew in stature, focused on symbolism that enhanced the wonder of her people, who prospered with trade in jewels and rare metal. Bridget and Rhiannon were both created as equals, and yet within a short space of time, the two lines of Fae grew to become very different as races. Bridget nurtured her people and educated them well, whereas Rhiannon saw her own line as two distinct, different types. In the line of the moon, those of privilege ran golden, which is seen in the colour of their hair. Those of darker hues, well, they were less valued and used only to toil in the mines below, lost to the darkness and never to be seen in the light of the moon. At the start of Rise of the Raven, Bridget Violet has spoken out and Rhiannon has taken offence. Rhiannon sees this as a personal attack on her, and she refuses to admit she favours one half of her people more than the other half. Now, because Rhiannon will not take Bridget's comments in the spirit that it is given, which is one of concern, it divides the lines of Fae, who up until that point had worked together to help improve the lives of men. Albanlin interferes and demands that the two lines settle their dispute, which they do, but it leaves a feeling of bitterness below the surface, and things are never quite the same again between Bridget and Rhiannon. It is during this time Rhiannon is awarded the realm of Avalon, as Herne feels that the Fae of Moon should be more accessible to all of the realms, and Avalon, after all, lies in the heart of everything. With her anger simmering, but appearing hospitable, Rhiannon sends down her workers to start the building of the realm, and just as Bridget stated, it is those of dark hair who are sent to carve out the realm and create a city of great wonder to the glory of Rhiannon. One of her dark-haired subjects is Branna, who is a Fae of great skill of the mind. The story of Branna again highlights my feelings when I was young towards the girl who was worshipped and praised, and yet in my eyes she was not that nice a person. I know of people who she did not like, and she picked on them and ridiculed them. Behind closed doors she gossiped and started rumours about people, which again, some of those were my friends, and her lies caused a lot of heartache for those who surrounded me, one of which was one of my female friends. And for this podcast, I will call her Jess. Now Jess was pretty. She had a nice figure, and I thought she was a really kind person. And yet the rich girl hated her and made her life a life of living hell. But it was never to her face. Jess suffered all kinds of awful rumours, none of which were true, and the worst of which was the rumours of her sleeping around and flirting with teachers. For Jess it was heartbreaking, because none of it was true, and eventually, after months of suffering some bad situations where she was confronted by girls who accused her of actually sleeping with their boyfriends, one night on her way home, she got really badly beaten up. Shortly after the incident, she left, and I never saw her again. And it was after that that the truth came to the surface, that it was actually the rich girl who had made all of it up. She targeted her for no other reason than she did not like how much attention Jess got. But the facts were, Jess already had a boyfriend who lived close to her home, and she'd been dating him for quite some time, but he was at a different school to us. I've never forgotten how badly she was treated, and yet even after the truth came out, everybody still flocked to praise the rich girl, and they completely ignored what had been a hateful campaign to harm Jess. I've seen similar things happen throughout all of my work in life, where one person decides to single out another and make their life a nightmare. And from what I can tell, it is always out of some sort of feeling of superiority and arrogance. One person deems they are above the other, and so therefore looks down on them and humiliates them. It is those events that I have witnessed that have allowed me to portray Rhiannon for her overtly nice persona in public to her dark and vicious behaviour behind closed doors. It is a dark trait, and also, when you think about it, the simplest of traits, and yet when left unchecked, it can grow into a very powerful form of evil. I see so much of this today in modern society, with politicians and business leaders, celebrities, and the very, very rich. They attain a certain level within society where they actually start to believe their own myths, and they believe that they are invincible and above the laws that rule all others. Rise of the Raven highlights this, and so when I was writing the story, I chose to portray Rhiannon in her true form. And what that meant was, I hardly wrote her into the book. Just like Mason's character in the first Heirs to the Kingdom book, I wrote Rhiannon's actions as conversations between Branna and Ariel, or Master Elgin and Ariel. Rhiannon was never seen, and yet Luminaria would arrive to act out her orders to the will of her queen, all of which was conducted behind closed doors deep down in the caves of Avalon. Rhiannon never confronted those she accused, but her hand was long and her reputation was fierce, and that caused a great deal of fear for Ariel. The Circle of Darkness, which was the last book in the Heirs to the Kingdom series, and Rise of the Raven, which to a degree was the start of a long story which encompassed Heirs to the Kingdom, were in essence written to show how the darkness came into the world of the Fae and men. It was the start of the story of Branna, who studied the darkness and connected to the Merle, and in doing so made contact with it. Her connection brought a small part of the Merle down, which then used Roach, the Raven, as its host in order to live a life amongst the Fae and of men. I wrote the part of Branna through the Circle of Darkness to suggest that her actions brought darkness and evil into the world, but I gave that a slight flip when I published Rise of the Raven. Through the story of Branna and Ariel, I posed many questions about the perception of what the darkness could actually be. Was the evil that entered the world because of Branna? Was she responsible? Or was it simply part of the fabric of all that was created from the start of time? I left the reader to decide for themselves, and I feel Rise of the Raven did ask many questions. Branna and Ariel's love for each other was deep and unyielding, so much so that their separation left them both vulnerable and afraid. The connection between them was so strong, it finally led to their reunion, after both of them gave up the life they had known to form a new life together. The part of the Merle that inhabited Roach wanted only to be a part of the world that had been created. It was a mass of darkness that had great intelligence, and yet when given the chance by Branna, it actually sought independence to become a single living entity and live a life as an individual. Was it evil to want what so many others already had? Roach took the life of the Fey Marshals and also pushed Branna to take the life of Halbrand, as he considered raping Branna and taking her against her will. Now, it was clearly in his mind. He desired Branna. She was, after all, a Fey of beauty, far more attractive than any of those in the realm of men. Then, posing the question, who was right and who was wrong? Which act was more evil, Halbrand's or Branna's? I left that for the readers to decide, as that was the aim of the book and the whole point in writing it. The book was a search to discover the darkness that had entered the world, but also it was a journey to discover what was truly dark. Now, if you consider this point, Roach was fleeing discovery. She admits to Branna that Rhiannon knew of the Merle as she had tried to contact it. So, was Roach's act of killing Rhiannon's marshals an act of inherent evil, or was it her only chance to evade being caught and made a prisoner and puppet of Rhiannon, who would exploit her in order to gain dominance over the Merle? That question and the answer to it is up to you again to decide. Was Rhiannon's treatment of her people wrong, as Bridget pointed out? Or was it the only way she could guarantee the prosperity and survival of her race? She divided her people into two distinct lines, those of fair hair, who were favoured highly, and those of dark hair, who had no rights and were little more than slaves in their own land. Was this necessary, or was it oppression of the weak? In the midst of all of this, I placed Luminaria, sister to Fagin and daughter of Sequana, the Seer of White. Luminaria blindly obeyed her queen and hounded Ariel, and finally towards the end of the book, she found herself caught in an impossible situation. Luminaria was forced to consider what for her was the truth, and decide her own fate. Her choice was to disagree with her queen and yet carry out her orders with no mercy, or face her queen and tell her the truth of Ariel and her innocence, which she knew would enrage her. Luminaria was not kind to Ariel for most of the book, but was she evil or blinded to the real truth? It was through Luminaria I painted the position of the reader and left all of you, like her, to make your own choice. Once again, I allowed you, the reader, to decide, and towards the end of the book, I posed the choice: who was more evil and dark, Rhiannon or Branna? Rise of the Raven gave me a wonderful chance through all of the characters to show the best and the worst of people today. I published the book and then gave all of you the chance to be the jury and the judge on each of the characters, to make your own determinations as to what was and what was not the most evil and the darkest of acts. The most wonderful aspect of writing this book was that I knew when it was published I would never get my answer, for only each reader would know what they had decided. And kind of in a way, I liked the idea of that, as it made the experience of reading it deeper and far more of a personal journey, which after all, should be the point of reading a good book. The next book that follows Rise of the Raven will add more to the process, as the arc story of Branna and Ariel will continue with the release of the Countess of Darkness. The book again is designed to make you think and consider all of the characters and pose new questions. And so, until then, having done this podcast, I shall leave all of you to ponder for a little while longer.
Thanks for listening to the Writer Life podcast. If you have enjoyed this episode, or there are areas of Robin's stories you would like him to discuss, please add your thoughts and questions in the comments, and we will include them in a future episode. You can follow Robin on all his social media links, which you will find listed below, and please, like and subscribe to this channel, so you get the latest notifications when he posts. All Robin's books are available in digital and print formats to purchase or download through all online book sales sites.